All right, we are officially recording. So I just want to welcome everyone to our continuation of our Grant Wood lecture series that the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art has been doing to go along with our Grant Wood Moment, our Grant Wood Revealed exhibition, Seriously Funny, the American Gothic Parodies, and of course, Americans in Paris, Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn's 1920 trip to France. So we are thrilled to be able to offer this lecture series, and it has come through a number of foundations that I will mention here. So we want to be sure to thank the Henry Luce Foundation, the McIntyre Foundation, the Esther and Robert Armstrong Charitable Trust, Collins Aerospace, CRST International, and Great America Financial Services, which are donor-advised funds of the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation. And of course, annual support has been provided by the Iowa Arts Council, which is a division of the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, the National Endowment for the Arts, Funds for the Community 2020 of the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation, members of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, many of you I see here, and contributors to our museum's annual fund. Additional education programming was provided by Transamerica. So we have many people to thank for being able to put this wonderful series of programs together. And to be more specific, I am so happy to be able to introduce our speaker this afternoon, who is Deba Leach. And Deba, if you're unfamiliar with her, you're missing out because she's a delight. She is a fourth-year PhD student specializing in American art and architecture at the University of Iowa. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in English at Manhattanville College, a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from Catholic University, and a Master of Arts in Art History from the University of Iowa. Her primary area of research is American art and architecture of the 20th century. And we know her at the CRMA because she has previously served on the CRMA Board of Trustees and worked very closely with museum staff, developing two major exhibitions, Art in Roman Life and Grant Wood Studio, both of which were big blockbusters early in the new millennium. So I think lots of people remember those and remember her work on them. So Deba is currently writing her dissertation on American artist Doris Lee, the title of which is Doris Lee, Self, Society, and Place, which will present and examine a series of paintings to illuminate the education, work life, social, and cultural milieu of the Midwest-born modernist. This work will inform the talk she's sharing with us today, which covers the remarkable coincidences in the lives, careers, and sensibilities of Grant Wood and Doris Lee, and providing a close reading of two of their works, Grant Wood's Dinner for Threshers from 1934 and Doris Lee's Thanksgiving from 1935. So as I turn things over to Deba, I will just remind everyone to be sure to mute your microphone so we don't accidentally disrupt Deba. And the way we've been handling questions in these talks, which has worked really well thus far, is to write them in the chat. And then just because we get a lot of people on these calls, and so if you write your question in the chat when Deba is done and open for questions, I can read those to her. And I know she's also going to have us look for things in the paintings towards the end of the lecture and ask for some adjectives and ideas about these works. So you can throw all of that information in the chat as well. So it'll be in one place for her. And with that, I will turn things over to Deba and just say thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Kate. If the title of my talk seems provocative, it was meant to be. Given recent public discourse on the gender identity of regionalists like Grant Wood and Willa Cather, you might be expecting such revelations about regionalist Doris Lee. But my talk is less about gender identity than it is about equal rights. I'm shamelessly using Grant Wood's celebrity to put a spotlight on an artist I consider to be his female counterpart. I want to give equal time and at the same time unveil what makes her unique. Nope. Okay. There it goes. There. Okay. You see in this collage of photographs that span her entire career from the Depression into the activist 60s. I will look primarily at two of these paintings. With the first, I will show how similar her work can be to Grant Wood's and why you might mistake the two. The second, there we go. The second work will show emphatically why you would not mistake them. If I seem to wonder, it's because American art and visual culture in Wood and Lee's telling invites you to. I invite you to share your observations on the material presented here, especially as you notice how Wood and Lee are alike or unalike in their treatment of similar subjects. The two paintings by Lee that we will focus on date from the 1930s and 40s. One was made during the Depression and one in the period leading up to World War II. The paintings by Wood were made in the 1930s. You're probably wondering if Lee and Wood were acquainted. The answer is yes. They knew each other socially, they entered the same museum competitions, and they did business with the same art galleries and publishers. Before I launch into the slideshow, unfortunately, perhaps I should skip this part, but I want to thank people that I have been working with in my research. The archivists at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, and where they also have a great painting by Doris called Siesta. And the archivist Emily Jones at the Woodstock Artists Association and Museum. They also have art that they collected from the artists. And they have material on Doris Lee's first husband. And they have material on her second partner who lived with her and that she referred to as her husband. My strategy here is to demonstrate how a work of art can make you think of Grant Wood and Doris Lee. Suppose you're a collector of prints and you're in a commercial print business and you're flipping through a bin labeled regionalism and you come across this. Oh, we're not coming across that. We're coming across this. That was me in 1976 during our country's bicentennial, when everything was about being patriotic and consumers bought everything nostalgic. I was shopping for a gift for my sister. I've been curious about Doris Lee ever since. First, I was struck by the subject, and then I was struck by the density of the treatment of the leaves and the lively approach to the tree parts and the juicy organic sensation that you get from the mountains, and then like the horse. So I just thought it was a lovely piece. But I didn't know who made it. It has a little bit of a feel of a Courier Times print from the mid-19th century, until you notice the cars. Cars, like the horse-drawn carriage in the Courier Times print, pinpoint but do not restrict the scene to a particular time. These cars mimic a simplified version of the Ford Coupe, which was produced by the hundreds of thousands between 1932 and 1934, sometimes kept into service into the 1940s. To segue into the art world, these were the years when the federal government began to pay struggling artists to produce prints for public spaces. such as these prints in the University of Stanley Museum collection, which you can see when the fabulous new art museum building opens next fall. You just have to ask. The slide, the American Gothic and country wedding seen together, with apologies to the Art Institute for this portrayal of the painting. Although the Gothic revival building and the frontal centered arrangement of the figures tease and wood as the printmaker. The hills in the background are actually too vertical for a Grant Wood landscape, such as you see on the left. So the maker of this print is, of course, our person for the day, and that's Doris Lee. Although Lee's print has some of the characteristic of regional prints from the WPA, as it happens, Lee's country wedding was not created as a WPA-sponsored project. The artist was actually too rich to qualify for federal support. Rather, the print was made as the result of a collaboration with a commercial venture, the Associated American Artists, founded by Reeves Lewenthal in the 1930s in New York. The idea behind the AAA prints, as with the WPA prints, was to give work to artists, to make affordable art, but also to widen the market by offering art with subjects that would appeal to the largest audience. It was a for-profit enterprise. And you can see here, there's an advertisement. You could get a Grant Wood print for $5. I believe this is from the late 30s. And there are receipts which show that Doris Lee was in a contractual arrangement with the business. And then up through the 70s, she was making some type of royalty for a print, for either a sale or because there was a commissioned advertisement that used her painting or her print. These works were sold for $5 a piece, and they were sold throughout 50 department stores across the country. And by 1944, the organization was bringing in more than $1 million a month. So both Lee and Wood worked with the AAA and profited from that collaboration. The scope of the AAA business from the 1930s to the 2000s is covered in this catalog, Art for Every Home, published in 2015. A comprehensive and critical compendium of not just print titles, but also textiles and ceramics designed by the participating artists. With the AAA, Lee produced 20-something prints, 9 of them in the 1930s and 40s. The last print, the modernist arrangement of shapes called Fruit, Still Life, was produced in 1968. By comparison, the well-known regionalist Thomas Hart Benton is listed as having printed 54 prints. Grant Wood, 24, Arnold Blanche, 6, and Yasuo Kuniyoshi, Lee's modernist neighbor and friend, 1 print. The exhibition catalog also shows 5 of Lee's ceramic designs and 1 textile called Curio Cabinet, seen here in a swatch sample held at the Cooper Hewitt. And you see also Grant Wood's textile. If you saw the 2005 Cedar Rapids Art Museum Grant Wood exhibition curated by Jane Blush, you might recall the installation that looked much like this 1952 Macy's installation of these products. Wood and Lee also worked with other publishers, for example, to illustrate children's books. In Lee's case, she worked with the American humorist James Thurber for his book, The Great Clue. And she also worked for a publisher who created a very interesting series about American rivers and how they happened to come to be. Lee's practice was to sketch, or as Russell Lee scholar Mary Jane Apple has pointed out, photograph in the field. She would then go back to her studio, paint an easel painting, and later, with the auspices of the AAA, decide to reproduce the painting in another more affordable format as a signed, limited edition lithographic print. And she would draw with a crayon a mirror version of the painting onto a lithographic stone. She would turn the stone over to a skilled printer to produce the actual print, which she would then sign in pencil. So here are a few, couple other examples of Doris Lee churning her paintings into prints. And that's the subject of today. This last version also indicates how a colorized print was used by an advertiser to sell coffee. Unfortunately, the painting that presumably preceded this print is missing. So there are quite a few of these paintings from the 1930s, which went into private collections, and they haven't surfaced. Hopefully people have kept them. He worked with another publisher, and this publisher was someone who thought that it would be interesting to take paintings by contemporary painters and make them into Christmas cards. But he also gave these artists the chance to write a personal statement about their art and about their personal history. And then he gave them about 50 pages within such a publication to show the public the scope of their paintings and in some cases prints, but mostly each of the pages in this book represents a painting. And sometimes it mentions that the painting was collected by an art museum, which was a point of pride. But she was in pretty good company. So in that book, she mentions some personal history that she thinks is important, that helps interpret her work or give you a sense for what inspired it, such as having lots of family and having access to the country. So we look back at the print, and we also have information that there was a photograph in the Colorado that inspired her church. I want to go back for a second. I don't see the photograph here, but there was a photograph that she took a vacation in that, and that is going to come up you're going to see it. But also in her personal history, she was such as might have been pictured in her print. Yeah, and it was in a picturesque Gothic sorted church outside Chicago. And she went to Colorado Springs, as I said, and when she was there, she took a car trip. And the car trip brought her into contact with this church. And you even see the cars in front of the church. And that is a picture that's in her archives. So it just instantly makes you think of the car trip that Grant Wood took, where he had a similar experience where he saw a Gothic revival structure that inspired American Gothic. So it's tempting to say that Country Wedding was made in part as homage to Grant Wood's American Gothic. So here's the painting and the snapshot of the church. And there's the church as it exists. And then the possible source for the construction and the design of the church, which was promoted by both Episcopalian and Presbyterian church authorities. And so here you have the similar, but not exactly alike reactions to a particular type of vernacular architecture. If Lee's memory guided her to paint a narrative about weddings, her imagination and her thought process guided her to dislodge the church from its rocky mountain landscape and reposition it in a landscape she saw as more fitting, more picturesque, the one that she experienced and witnessed every day in the foothills of the Catskill Mountains. When she painted Country Wedding in the middle of this landscape, she was in the historic artist conclave of Birdcliff, which is adjacent to Woodstock. And these are the mountains that, if you visit Woodstock, you turn and you look a couple of directions, north or west, and you've got this landscape. You can't escape it. It's pretty terrific. So this is the landscape where she lived for the first 10 years in close to Woodstock, in an arts and crafts house. And for the next 10 years, she lived south of Woodstock in a house whose back porch of which faced that landscape. And you can't quite see it because the trees have blocked it. But so that's what their house looked like. And that is the interior. And then from the next until her death, Doris lived in this house, which she designed and had constructed with her partner, Mr. Leach. And here's a wonderful painting that relates to that house that is at the Figge. So in 1942, Country Wedding was part of this exhibition in Manhattan, and it was obviously a patriotic exhibition. And that at that point also it was reproduced, as often happened with her paintings, in Life magazine. And it was interesting, I thought, that there was a letter to the editor by someone who lived in Colorado. He was stressing how wonderful that this artist was able to depict such an accurate copy of this particular church. And it just goes to the extreme in American public's reaction to painting, that we like to see representation, things that we can recognize. So there's the painting and the print. And there it is with Mr. Wood. So by 1942, the year she painted Country Wedding, Doris Lee was in her element. She had completed a U.S. Treasury section of painting and sculpture mural for the new U.S. Post Office on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, a high-style building designed by prominent architects. She had been the subject of a 4-page feature profile in Life. And she was one of 100 female painters from across the country chosen to exhibit in the American Art Today World's Fair exhibition. Lee resisted being characterized as a painter of optimism, but like Wood, she is still best known for her work as a regionalist painter of scenes that make people nostalgic for a simpler life. Wood's life was cut short as Lee lived on. Lee's figurative art lived on too, although it began to turn. It became more abstract, less, I guess, juicy, less nostalgic, but still evocative and in direct dialogue with her modernist Woodstock friends, such as Milton Avery. This is work by Doris, and this is a portrait of her by her friend Milton. And this is a landscape. So she did become quite abstract. And here's an example of Yasuo Kushi, who I think that they were in conversation with each other with this type of printmaking. And this is actually a photograph that he took of her. So you see here examples of work, black and white reproduction of a painting from the 1930s, and then one from the 40s, and later in the 60s. And then there's a sequence of females that go from the 30s to the 60s. Pay attention to the hats. Grant Wood and Doris Lee both grew up in the Midwest. Wood was born in rural Jones County in Iowa, not far from the city of Cedar Rapids, and Lee was born 13 years later in the county seat of Mercer County, a town called Aledo, not far from the Quad Cities, in 1904. Each depicted the land they loved. Their two backgrounds were not alike. Each came from loving families, and neither had children of their own. But Wood spent his years working on the farm, not just visiting. He lost his father at age 10, and he struggled to get an education in art. Lee grew up in town, had a successful merchant father, banker, who believed in the educational value of travel and had the best education money could buy. That was her prep school. And here's her college education. She went to Paris and practiced Cubism and looked at centuries of earlier art. She went to Kansas City at the Art Center and practiced Impressionism with this painter. Those are his paintings, not hers. And ultimately, these are his paintings, not hers. Ultimately, she embraced a modernist kind of realism, American realism, after meeting her teacher and future lover, Arnold Blanche, the teacher, in San Francisco, during a time when Diego Rivera was in San Francisco with his wife. By the 1940s, both Wood and Lee had developed individual styles and continued to draw from past, especially for Lee from early American and folk. Wood and Lee were represented by New York art galleries and reviewed by New York critics. But they cultivated the artistic personas of folks who live in the provinces, painters who were serious and yet approachable. You might say Midwestern nice. Both Wood and Lee are known for how they treated American folk tales as well as folk ways, that is, with a sense of humor. And like Wood, Lee was inspired by subject matter she could find close at hand, often in her own backyard. But the most remarkable coincidence in the professional lives of Doris, Lee, and Grant Wood is that within a few years of each other, each artist gained instant national fame. Lee through a fluke response from a dissatisfied patron, and they both won these competitions at the Art Institute of Chicago. In Wood's case, of course, the painting was American Gothic, and for Lee, it was Thanksgiving. You may have seen Thanksgiving in Chicago. It is displayed during the holidays. Usually it has hung rather inauspiciously in a corridor by the elevator. The museum sells printed versions of the painting in the form of postcards and photo reproduction prints. Just the other day, a friend recognized the subject of my research, whose famous painting I had on my cell phone, and she said, I have that print in my kitchen. In recent years, as art by women has been having its moment, the museum has hung the work in the gallery with American Gothic and included the picture in major shows. Thanksgiving was created during the height of the Depression. This was a time when the government and much of the public called for art that honors the American worker. With her picture, Lee expanded the classification of worker to include the American woman who works not in the field, the factory, or office, but in the family kitchen. In this, Lee distinguished herself from most of her regionalist contemporaries, except perhaps her friend Grant Wood. Consider Lee's version of women with aprons working in a kitchen to prepare a meal, alongside Wood's version of women in aprons working in a kitchen, preparing and serving. Wood's picture was created in 1934, Lee's a year later. It is possible Lee saw Wood's picture when it was exhibited at the Carnegie Institute's International Exhibition. It is tempting to read Lee's female-dominated Thanksgiving as a response to the Woods' male-centric dinner for Threshers, in which his women appear ideal, and hers seem to be saying, let's get real. Wood's tableau relates to medieval religious altarpieces, triptychs in which the figures and objects are meant to inspire prayer, even adoration. Lee's picture resembles 17th century Dutch secular interiors, which can look a bit more like a precursor ad for IKEA. Indeed, such pictures at the time said there is no shame in material gain. There's certainly virtue in every woman keeping an orderly home. Furthermore, Lee picked up on Dutch perspective-making devices, such as the through door, right here, and right here, and here, and the checkered floor. In Lee's picture, 10 humans and 2 pets occupy the composition. While 8 of the figures are adult women, 4 are busy at work. You could say in the American home, at least once a year, one woman does the work of at least 4. So you have, in this picture, I'm going to show you some details. And as you go through, you might start making a list of things that you think are interesting. But here's the little girl in the picture, and in her artist statement, the artist says that when her family got together, she was in charge of the place cards. And then you have the brother, perhaps, in the picture, who really isn't helping, but he is quietly, perhaps, appreciative. Then you have the little babies, and just as a humorous gesture, the painter has the baby's arms extending just a little bit like the turkey's feet. So I thought that was kind of cute. You have the woman bending in the classic worker position, and then you have a dog who actually is a figure in other paintings by Lee, and also appears in a photograph. The photograph was of her when she was about 6. And you have the little humorous detail of the little girl with her panties showing, and she's feeding the cat. And you have the baker making what looks like a pumpkin pie, perhaps. And you have the one in the back who's getting the dishes off the carefully organized open shelves. And then you have the humorous character who's carrying delicately a bottle of milk, I assume, and perhaps some vegetables from the garden. And then at the center, you have this character who, and I should mention, each of the people are individual in proportion and even facial characteristics, but they are a bit cartoonish, we have to say. And here's this woman who represents the outside of the house. And I'm associating her with Grandwood's appraisal, and perhaps this female figure is the mistress of the house, and is the mistress of the house who is purchasing the bird. So in the narrative, he is sending a mixed message, appearing to celebrate a national tradition. The artist is actually exposing the ferocious nature of the activity required to maintain it. What Lee herself characterized as a kind of violence. Can there be any doubt that Thanksgiving is meant to expose what goes on in the kitchen before Grandma presents the bird to the table, such as we see with the Norman Rockwell picture? It's interesting that Lee chose to depict a home of order and plenty in the middle of the Depression, when it might have seemed more appropriate to depict a motless house, even a shack. As a stark contrast, consider the work of Lee's husband, FSA photographer Russell, who abandoned the idea of being a painter and began to tour for the government to capture real life appearances of homes and kitchens. Also, by contrast, consider Grandwood's Dinner for Threshers, a picture of another home with order and plenty, also created in the Depression. The size is different. This is a 2 feet by 8 feet. Its format is not a simple easel painting, rather it's like a mural or a triptych or an altarpiece. Lee's painting dares to reveal work for what it was. Wood's depiction is meant to simply honor such work. The result of a scene is a scene of classical calm. The cutaway view of the vernacular home is a counterpart to these. Here, I would like you to join the audience and with your chat feature, make some comparisons between these two paintings. Point out the details that each artist carefully picked and carefully placed, and tell me where you see similar things. And I'll just point to, here's a print in Grandwood's painting, which I think looks just like one of those WPA prints, and perhaps a AAA print. And here is an unidentified piece of artwork in Doris Lee's picture, basically at center. So those are two similarities that I see in these two pictures, but look at them yourselves. And at the same time, I would like to have some suggestions on adjectives that can characterize the work of these two artists, because I think at this point it would be interesting to shake it up a little bit. One person said that they thought Grandwood's was more static, and another person has characterized Doris Lee's work as frantic. So I want you to start using your chat feature to help identify details and also come up with some good terms. And I'll just keep talking. Others have been looking at the art of Doris shortly after her death of Alzheimer's in 1983, a condition reportedly diagnosed as early as 1968. The same year Blanche left her for a younger artist. He's a state art dealer, D. Wigmore, in Manhattan, thankfully facilitated the gift of E's paper to the National Museum of Women in the Arts. She mounted nearly a dozen exhibitions. And in 2008, Roberta Smith from New York Times finally wrote something about Lee. And she said that it was high time art history take Lee into account. So next fall, you'll have the chance to see a retrospective of Lee's paintings and prints and decorative objects at the Figge. There's a show put together by Lee enthusiasts and scholars. I intend to offer a tour of the shows and invite you to come. So I think that we have reached the point where we're going to open things up.
Okay. So I'll start with the first one, just asking for like an off the cuff comment on the question you posed, like what if Grant Wood was a girl? Do you think his life would have had the similar trajectory to Doris's, or what's your thought?
I was going to conclude with something very profound. And I was going to quote myself, but you've seen how biography and artistic choices enter into the creation of a painting. And I think that it's fair to talk about how biography influences the take that you have on the figures that you're presenting. So I think that because of the way that she had such a female-oriented personal history, and she went to female schools, all female schools, she was very deeply schooled in recognizing certain characteristics that happen in that precinct of women. And so if he had been a girl and he had the same privileges as she, perhaps his work would be different. But it's just to point out it's a biographical issue as much as anything, with people who are figurative in their art and who try to appeal to the public in that period of our country's history. So if he'd been a girl, perhaps he would have painted like Doris Lee.
Awesome.
Okay.
Next question asks, was Doris's marriage with Russell an unhappy one? Says in the Wikipedia entry on him, she's not even mentioned.
Well, we're going to look to other people who looked at that issue for them to answer that question. I can say that I did come across a letter that when Arnold, who was her second sort of husband in quotes, when he left her, her good friend was a psychiatrist, and she wrote a letter to Doris that suggested that it was not a nice thing for him to have done, especially when Doris paid such good attention to him and was so much of his partner. So, but as far as the Russell marriage, I have been told that it was because they had so much time apart, because of his work and her focus on hers, that they just didn't have that much connection at some point. So it was a mutual decision.
Understandable. How long did Lee live in Illinois and Wisconsin, and when did she move to New York State?
Well, she lived in Illinois until she was about 20.
Okay.
Yeah, but she took trips. Her parents thought the travel was important, so they had car trips to California. And in high school, she actually went to Berkeley High School in California. And that was an interesting little thing. And then also she went to New York for 2 years to Russell Sage as a freshman and a sophomore in college. So that gave her exposure to the East Coast. She moved to Woodstock when she in 1931. So she was in her late 20s.
Lovely.
Mhm.
Next question is wondering if you think Grant Wood's sexual orientation factors into his work and in your comparison, and if you'll be including how Grant Wood might feature into your dissertation if in fact he is going to
Well,
play a part in it.
this was a very exploring type of exercise that I did, and it did make me interested in certain aspects of that recent history that's been discussed by really terrific people. But I'm going to have to look more closely to see how I make something happen with that topic.
Cool. And last one, where is the exhibition that you mentioned? Where is that going to be and when is
The exhibition was open last September, but because of COVID, they couldn't. But they did publish the book, and we didn't show those slides.
Oh, we didn't get all the way down.
Yeah, so here, excuse me, this is the catalog. So that's going to happen, and it's going to be at the Figgy next September in 2022.
Oh, wonderful. That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
What?
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that is? The Finney.
The
The Figgy.
Figgy. The Figgy Art
What is
Museum is in Davenport, Iowa. Excuse me? It's, I'm not absolutely certain, but it's September of 2022.
Yeah, but where is it? I don't know where that is.
Davenport, Iowa. In the Quad Cities.
We put it in the chat too.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Well, that was all of the questions I saw. But I just wanted to take another time to thank you, Deba. That was such an amazing
you.
talk. I loved it. I learned a lot. And if anyone knows of a Doris Lee painting, you know, without a home, certainly think of the CRMA because we'd love to add
That
one
would
to
be
our
good.
collection.
Yeah. This
So
is a
thank
print
you
that
so
you
much.
see. There's a print back here that you can see.
Yes. Oh, wonderful.
How many Doris paintings are at the Art Institute?
Just the Thanksgiving.
I was privileged to go to the Art Institute during one of the few times they had Grant Wood's American Gothic. Of course, they had Nighthawks by Hopper, and they had Whistler's Mother there for a few times. And all three of them were there the same day.
Good. Did Kate? Did people come up with details from the two paintings that they?
Yes, you have a lot of really good words and thoughts on those.
Good. I can't wait.
Yeah, those look great. Lots of people had some excellent observations for you.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you again for the opportunity. And I love the Cedar Rapids Art Museum for its tradition of keeping this artist interesting to people. And I think that Doris Lee has the potential to have as many things about her that we can keep unearthing, because I didn't even scratch the surface with their output.
Oh, I'm sure not.
She has.
She looks fascinating. Well, thank you, everyone.
Well,
this
thank
has been
you.
such a lovely afternoon. And thanks
Thank
again
you.
to Deba. That was fantastic.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, Kate. It was
My
great.
pleasure. Thank you.